Good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this, our 11th episode of the Transforming the Future of Land Management webinar series. My name's Matthew Morris. I'm a land steward with the Duchy of Cornwall, and I'm joined as ever by Tim Hopkin, who is the founder of the Land Hub. Today, we're going to be focusing on the global context. And I'm delighted that we're going to be joined by Hilary Allison from the UN Environment Programme World Conservation Monitoring Centre. In a slight departure from the norm, I'm also going to present some slides today, but in a way that hopefully we get lots of engagement from you, the audience, and more about that in a moment. It's very easy in times of crisis to become insular and to focus on your own problems, whether that's at an individual level, a regional or national level. But we face challenges on a global scale, from a health perspective, from an economic perspective, and of course, from an environmental perspective. The land management sector is perhaps uniquely placed in that it can contribute positively to tackling all those changes and more beyond. In the UK, we have a responsibility not only to do the right thing for ourselves and our country, but also for our planet. And the one thing that the COVID crisis has done is to strip back economies to their bare bones. And therefore, there's no better time to build those back in a better way. To build back with the knowledge we have of the damage that we can do to our planet and how to avoid this. And to build back in a sustainable and more green way. As His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales has said, the time to act is now. Just a quick bit of housekeeping. Your camera and microphone will always remain off during the session. At the bottom of the screen, the Q&A button, you're all familiar with that now. Now, as I'm also speaking today, and I can't do two things at once, we're going to run the Q&A slightly differently. And what I'm going to do is ask you to contribute your thoughts whilst I'm speaking onto the Q&A tab, and I'll explain more about that in a little while. You can also see the chat function at the bottom. Please use that to direct any technical queries to Tim relating to the webinar. I think that's it from me for now. You will hear from me very shortly. Tim, just a quick overview of the session today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Matthew. So yes, I'm sure most of you know me by now. My name is Tim Hopkin. I'm the founder of the Land App. So yeah, just a quick overview of the way today's session is going to go. It's ever so slightly different to normal. So, let's go up. So the agenda today is, firstly, what we're going to do is Matthew and I are going to cover what we've achieved today, just a quick summary of the 11 episodes that we've had and some of the key achievements. Then Hilary is going to be presenting on the global perspective, and then Matthew is going to present Global Goals UK in the land management context. Then Matthew and Hilary are going to have a conversation about the Sustainable Development Goals and how that relates to land management in the UK. And then we're going to share a little bit about what the next steps are for Land Management 2.0. It's probably also a good opportunity now just to reiterate a little bit about what Land Management 2.0 is all about. Essentially, for Matthew and I, this is really the space to have the land management conversation for the whole sector, hooked under the objective and the mission of how do we transform the future of land management in the UK, if not globally, as we continue to roll out. And how can we turn the UK into a case study for the rest of the world? How can we work together, shoulder to shoulder, going forward into the future? So that really is what Land Management 2.0 is about. It's a not-for-profit community collaboration. So just to reiterate, that's what we're here for. That's what we're here to facilitate and support. So very much a community endeavour. So quickly, just jumping into some of the achievements to date. What have we achieved? So far, we've had 10 sessions, 10 webinars. We've had 6 roundtables. You can see the viewer numbers there. So 2016 viewers of the webinar series with over 200,000 minutes of viewing time. And so in total, we've had, if you see down at the bottom, 5.8 total months of viewing time of the webinar series so far to date, which is a huge achievement considering this is such a light enterprise with volunteers just keeping it going. So I want to say a huge thank you to everyone that's been part of the conversation so far. It's an amazing achievement to have supported the sector so much. So then how does that break down? How does it break down into the individual sort of the people that are coming in. So we have around 20% are consultants. We've got 3.2% education, nearly 10% government, a little bit of finance, 14% membership organizations, although we think a lot of the domain, which is the Google Mails, etc., that we can't tell who they are, we suspect that might be the land management sector predominantly, membership bodies, NGOs, and other organizations out in the sector. So that's broadly the breakdown of who's been attending the webinars to date, and the conversation that we're going to continue to have with them. We also set up the Rural Land Management Slack community, which is off the back of the feedback for more interaction, more community, more engagement. So we have 446 people who have signed up to that community. There are currently 900 odd conversations that are currently underway in a whole variety of different subject areas, from regenerative agriculture, landscape scale design, regional groups in southeast, southwest, Midlands, etc., as well as topic areas like trees and woodland, trees and water, and soil, etc. So anyone that wants to be involved in that community, please do sign up. There'll have been a link sent through in the emails that you'll have received over the last few days. So do join up and join the conversation. And lastly, something that both Matthew and I are incredibly excited about is the Slido. And I know Matthew's got a few points that he wants to sort of share on some of the insights so far.
Yes, thanks, Tim. I mean, this is really what we've been calling the Slido of Slidos. What we've done is put all the words and all the answers to all the questions into one big Slido, just to see where those are landing. And you can see there that some of the same topics are cropping up. We've got knowledge and education consistently being mentioned. The importance of soil and food has been identified, and it's really fascinating. The Slido results are all on our website. Really interesting, and we hope that will form the basis for many more conversations, but also just perhaps steer us in terms of the direction of travel of the Land Management 2.0 sort of process and where we take it next. But I think there's lots of exciting headlines that come out of that, but it's just really interesting to see all those answers on one sheet. And I'm just reiterate Tim's point that we've got some great assistants in the background helping us put all these things together. We couldn't do it without you.
Great, thank you. So all of this will be shared afterwards, as you know. So now what we'll do is introduce Hilary Allison. So Hilary is Head of Programme at Ecosystem Assessment and Policy Support at the United Nations Environment Programme World Conservation Monitoring Centre. And Hilary is going to be presenting on the global perspective. So Hilary, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to hand it over to you and let you present.
Right, thank you very much indeed, both to Tim and Matthew. Hopefully you can all see the screen, is that okay?
Yes, we can see the first screen.
Excellent, good. Okay, so thank you very much everybody for the invitation to come along and have a conversation with you this afternoon. I won't call it anything as grand as a presentation because these are just a few thoughts. And I'll just stop my. Oh, God. That's embarrassing. Right, I'll put that away. I apologise. That's the golden rule of doing presentations. Turn your phone off before you start. So I do apologise. So yes, this is not. This is really some thoughts that I have rather than a sort of formal set of sort of well-honed themes and discussions, but I'm really excited that there are so many people on the webinar. I was, when Tim put up the sort of numbers that have been involved in these discussions, it really was quite something to behold, and I was very impressed with that. Now, although I'm reasonably familiar with what goes on in the UK from being involved in the UK scene for many years, I now have much more of an international perspective on things. And really what I wanted to do was give a bit of context about the global context within which land management is being discussed. I'm not an expert on this at all, but I am going to give you a very broad overview of some of the key things that are going on internationally. And I think that the first the first point I really want to make is that the UK is connected. You know, this is your discussions about land management are not happening in isolation from a massive global agenda, and there are many ways in which the agendas are connected, not least through the whole business of global trade, and some of the sort of major crises of our time. So the first slide is showing you something called the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, I hope that virtually everybody on the webinar has come across the Sustainable Development Goals, but I just wanted to talk about that because it's incredibly important context. So back in 2015, the world moved on from something called the Millennium Development Goals and agreed a new global agenda taking us up to 2030 about sort of prosperity for people and the planet. That's basically what the Sustainable Development Goals agenda is about. It's an integrated, indivisible, coherent agenda which kind of tries to describe the overall trajectory of the global community towards sustainability in the medium to long term. So there are 17 goals which you can see here on the slide, which are sort of succinct and which kind of cover a huge level of ambition for a better quality of life for both the planet and for the people who live in it. And those 17 goals are underpinned by 169 targets, most of which are reasonably smart and measurable and time-bound. Not quite all of them, but most of them are measurable and quite ambitious in many cases. And those targets in turn are measured by a framework of 232 indicators, which are overseen by the UN Statistics Commission, and which are subject to annual scrutiny at a major forum in New York every July, which is coming up. It's called the High Level Political Forum. So this global agenda is now signed up to. It's not a treaty, it's not a convention, but it's an international agreement, and all countries are in their own particular ways trying to take this globally agreed agenda for a new roadmap for prosperity for all, for people and planet, and trying to translate that into national action through their own sustainability plans. So that's the way in which the Sustainable Development Goals are appear in the form of that diagram. However, I mentioned that the Sustainable Development Goals are very much an integrated agenda. That is part of what makes them very special. But the 17 separate icons in a grid like that don't really give the full flavor. So some very knowledgeable and brainy people at the Stockholm Resilience Institute redrew the 17 logos of the Sustainable Development Goals into this so-called wedding cake diagram, which I quite like because it puts the biosphere related goals around water, climate action, life on land and life below water absolutely as being the underpinning goals for which on which everything else depends. Without a healthy biosphere, we won't have a healthy society and a healthy economy. So this diagram, I think, shows very clearly that the land, the core global resource that we have, and indeed the oceans, is critical to, and a healthy biosphere is critical to the underpinning of those goals, and that's really, really, really important. Now, this looks all very nice and coherent and sort of intellectually, what we would like to see, but I think it probably at this level, certainly at the goals level, it masks some quite interesting tensions when you get down to the level of targets, because some targets in the way that they're expressed do create the necessity to consider at national and indeed global level trade-offs. I mean, you think about the issues of protected areas, you think about the desire to protect biodiversity, and you set that against the fact that there are targets around increasing the revenue and livelihoods of smallholder farmers, and they need to feed a world that's of ever-growing number of people. So there are clearly some tensions there, and some what we call trade-offs. But there are also what we in rather jargonistic terms call synergies. Many of the goals work together, and if we can deliver on one goal, we can deliver on multiple goals at the same time. So there's a massive body of evidence that is now being built globally through the UN system about how all of the goals are intricately linked together, and that delivering on on these in a coherent and indivisible way is really critical. So that's a little bit of a background about the Sustainable Development Goals. It's going to be really important because Matthew's going to talk about that in his presentation in a moment, in a very much in a UK context. And I'm sure most of you are already very familiar with that background. But I wanted to also just mention that, in terms of the global perspective, there are some pretty staggering and pretty horrific statistics out there. And a lot of you will have come across IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. It's a long title. It has basically, IPBES aspires to be the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for biodiversity and ecosystem services and the environment effectively. It's trying to build this body of evidence to make sure that we understand fully the science behind the actions that we need to take, particularly in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals. And in 2018, IPBES published a global land degradation assessment, and the statistics really speak for themselves. Food production uses 50% of the habitable land in the world. 10 million people by 2050 are projected to exist, and that will mean up to a 50% increase in food production. How are we going to squeeze that out of the finite land resource we have? The land that is used, very much, a lot of it is degraded. There is a whole UN convention on combating desertification, which focuses very much on degraded land globally. Land degradation affects 29% of global land and 3.2 billion people, well over a third of the world's population at the moment. We have the pace of deforestation is slowing, as the recent Food and Agriculture Organization Global Assessment on Forests showed, but it's still continuing. So we have forest degradation as well as agricultural land degradation. We have increasing demands on urban by urbanization for land at a global level. We have a massive deficit in terms of freshwater withdrawals. Agriculture is very demanding. That has massive implications for the extent of freshwater resources. And over a period of a couple of centuries, we've lost nearly 10% of soil organic carbon across the globe. So there are some major issues in terms of the state and the stock and the quality of the land that we have at a global level. And some of those issues in a microcosm obviously affect us in the UK too. But I didn't want to dwell too much on some of those fairly stark facts, and IPBES is extremely good at not only presenting the state of various dimensions of the environment, whether it's looking at these thematic assessments on land degradation or biodiversity or ecosystem services and pollination and so on, but it is also very good at kind of describing in often quite simple terms some of the complexities of transformative change in terms of global systems that we need to effect in order to move us towards those Sustainable Development Goals and the Agenda 2030. So the UN has declared 2020 to 2030 the decade of action on the Sustainable Development Goals, which basically means that the UN system is focusing on accelerating many of the pathways to positive change and solutions to try and address the Agenda 2030. We also have a specific decade focused on ecosystem restoration, 2021 to 2030. And there's a massive program of action and awareness raising and solutions focused guidance emerging in response to that UN decade. And then, of course, we also have what should have been a biodiversity super year, or climate and biodiversity super year in 2020. Both the major global meetings on biodiversity and climate have obviously been postponed into 2021, but the bringing together of the climate and nature agenda has been an incredibly prominent part of the UN dialogue in terms of this current year and the coming years ahead. And a lot of that is expressed in terms of things like the dialogue on nature-based solutions, using working with nature and the services that it provides to kind of to address and improve the societal challenges such as climate change and land degradation. So this is where we get into some really interesting co-benefits. I mean, land is really at the core of all of this action, whether it's restoration of ecosystems, of forests, of coastlands, wetlands, tackling climate adaptation, climate mitigation, tackling biodiversity loss. Land is a common thread across all of these initiatives. And there are lots of ways in which we can start to think about sort of co-benefits, where your land is providing a way of achieving multiple objectives at the same time. So if we're talking about agroforestry, where agriculture and forestry can work together to deliver multiple benefits, we're talking about the carbon and the protecting nature agenda. There are lots of synergies there. We're talking about protected areas, but also an expansion of those, but also the way in which those protected areas can relate to livelihoods of people. So there's lots of co-benefits where land can bring together and catalyze, sustainable land management can catalyze a lot of the action that we want to see. And my last slide is just really to bring this back down to a UK level a little bit. So I mentioned that the High-Level Political Forum, which is the main kind of governance by which the SDGs are reviewed at a global level within the UN system, countries are invited to and encouraged to present voluntary national reviews of how they're doing in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030. And last year, the UK prepared a fairly comprehensive, nearly 200-page voluntary national review of how it perceived it was doing towards the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals. And there's some interesting text in there around the challenges of environmental land management, which I've just put up there as a quote to give you a little bit of context. And although the language that we use in the UK is about sort of public benefits, public goods, we're talking very often about the same things as ecosystem services and nature's contributions to people, which kind of are more globally used terms to describe some of the things that land, when sustainably managed, can provide to us. So the final point I just wanted to make was that I think where this sort of UK versus global dimension comes in is that I think our choices in the UK about how we manage our land are not done in isolation. We're not an island. Very often the decisions we make about the farming systems, the timber production systems, the way which we manage our land have very, very strong overseas implications. We're not only contributing to global efforts for sustainability, and not only are we able to export the expertise that we have abroad, and hopefully we can also receive expertise from overseas. There are some great examples that the UK could also learn from. And in terms of the trade and the sort of global trade and the choices that we make as consumers, those often affect land management decisions overseas in terms of our consumption of products like cocoa or palm oil or soy or whatever. And the impact that we have as consumers on land management and sustainability overseas is sometimes called telecoupling, but it's nonetheless it's a hidden, but it's a hugely impactful way in which we have impacts on what happens overseas almost without realizing it. I think I've probably spoken for far too long, so I will stop there and hand over to Matthew, I think.
Thank you, Hilary. Right, I'm going to endeavour to share my screen now. Didn't go so well in practice, so let's try. There we go. Just come to the start, and we'll start. So, am I on the right page, Tim, or do I need to?
Yeah, go to display settings, Matt, and then exactly that should do. There you are. We can see full screen now.
Okay, well, hopefully I don't need any introduction, having spoken to you for the last 10 weeks. What I'm going to do is just taking sort of the points that Hilary's made and just bring them back to a sort of, some specific examples of from a UK perspective. And I think when we're looking at these sustainable development goals, I think it's quite easy for many managers and businesses to think that these lofty ideals and these goals don't apply to them. As I said in my intro, it's easy to lose that global context. It's easy to think local and become insular. But these goals potentially touch every aspect of any business, and they should be considered as if, if we're going to build back in that sustainable, greener way, then we need to be looking at these goals at every decision point. I'm very fortunate to work for the Duchy of Cornwall, which does reflect how we attain our strategic objectives. They get reported in our annual report. I'd love to show you the latest one, but it actually gets presented to Parliament next week, so it's not in the public domain yet. What I'm going to do is go through each of these just very briefly in turn, giving the UK context and perhaps one or two Duchy examples. And hopefully what we will see is that sort of synergy and crossover between those objectives that Hilary mentioned earlier. I do want this session to be interactive. So what I'm proposing is that for each of these goals, as they pop up on the screen, in the Q&A, I'd like you to just pop the number of the goal. So for example, goal 8, good jobs, just put number 8. And then I'd like everybody to just, put their thoughts as to how the UK land management sector can deliver against that goal. So we'll do it as we come to each one. But hopefully at the end of this, we'll build up quite a nice picture of how this collective audience think that we can deliver. So let's go straight into them. So the first one, no poverty. The rural land sort of landscape, is often thought of as a rural idyll by those people that don't live there. But what it can do is mask pockets of very real poverty. One of the most striking ones is fuel poverty. Not everybody has the luxury of mains gas. In some cases, there are no alternatives to oil because they may lack poor power infrastructure, for example. But there are other barriers to coming out of poverty. Poor transport links can hold people back. And as we know, broadband and connectivity is vital. The picture there is for it's actually taken up in Cumbria. It's the Barn project where they've connected communities in what is a pretty wild landscape, but it's been transformational in terms of people's learning and giving people access to knowledge. No hunger. I'd like to say that in 2020 that no one in the UK goes hungry, but sadly that is not true. We've seen food banks being used at record levels. The picture on the top right for me is the striking one. We all saw that in March. I don't think we ever conceived that we would see empty shelves in the UK. I think it highlighted the fact that we've got a very fragile food supply network, and that in promoting sustainable agriculture, we need to also look at resilience in terms of food supply. We need to think about the impacts of climate as well, particularly when we look back at the last 2 months, incredibly dry. It's pouring with rain today, but it's been incredibly dry, and we need to think about that resilience to climate change. We also need to think in a local context as well. There's some talk now about going back to local abattoirs just to sort of shorten those supply chains, which is quite important. The other picture up there is of the Kew Millennium Seed Bank, and that diversity of plants as well is incredibly important as we protect ourselves moving forwards, to make sure we don't lose heritage varieties, but we keep that diversity of species. So don't forget, as we go along in the Q&A, if you've got thoughts as to how the land management sector can contribute, please pop them in there. Good health. Again, land management sector has an opportunity to work as almost the natural health service. We saw through COVID how people were desperate to go outside, get into open spaces, and the difficulties of managing that. National parks, beaches, we all saw it on the news. But that growth in outdoor education and outdoor recreation is really important, and equally important is how we manage it and also how we fund it. The picture there is actually of our green space that we provided as part of our scheme at Nansledden in Newquay, and that saw extraordinary use during lockdown as people discovered it as an open space and went and enjoyed it, which was fantastic. The other aspect of health is, of course, mental health, and particularly in the rural sector, in agriculture particularly, it's quite an isolated industry, and the importance of mental health should not be ignored. And there's some great charities doing some great work out there, helping people in real need. The quality of education is also vital for our sector. There's a thirst for knowledge. We've seen that in our Slido answers. It starts with the schools and the colleges. We've had an education roundtable as part of this series, and next week I'm involved in a pilot where we're delivering some virtual work experience for land management professionals, talking to sixth formers about the industry and what we do on a daily basis, just to try and attract more people in. But that learning should continue through life. You see there a group of Dorset farmers on one of their farm walks. Seeing is believing, and you've got to keep learning, to keep adapting, and we're in this process of change, and it's so important that we keep on learning. It's just so important. On the subject of gender equality, it's said that no country can truly develop if it leaves half its population behind. Of our 180,000 farmers in the UK, about 17% are female. And I suspect that's a feature of the industry and kind of historical, just the way things were done. I'm pleased to say that the Duchy, we gradually got one or two females as sole tenants. We've also got a large number of joint tenancies at the Duchy. The top picture is Emily Suavo, who's a tenant on our Newton Park estate. She's got 300 acres, specialist cropping, including quinoa and a 6-acre vineyard. Bottom left, we've got Sam and Emily Stables up in Herefordshire. And on the right-hand side, we've got Kevin and Justina Hughes, who are joint tenants up in Herefordshire as well. And I think outside of the industry, the land management sector is getting a lot better, and we're definitely seeing a great improvement in terms of gender equality, particularly in professional services as one sector. Water and the sustainable management of it is paramount. On a wet Thursday, it's easy to think that the rain will never stop, but just look at the last 2 months, as I said. We have to look after it, and managing those catchment areas is absolutely key. Tim and I spoke earlier this week to the Cambridge Institute of Sustainable Leadership, and they were telling us about their catchment management declaration that they've been doing with water companies and land managers in water catchment areas, and it's so important. It's also vital that we think ahead. Today's slurry landing on the ground, the nitrates can take up to 60 years to filter through to the aquifers. And, you sort of look back as to how things were done even 20 years ago, and you think there's a problem coming down the road. But we have to look after our water. Renewable energy, we have a huge part to play, the sector. We have the space to grow biomass crops. We've got opportunities for solar on the ground and on the roofs. This is our home farm at Highgrove with solar panels on the roof of the cubicle shed. There's also opportunities for wind power, but what we have to do is think about the environmental impact of those alternative energies. And we also have to think about, food security, particularly in the context of bioenergy crops. It's really vital that we think all sort of eventualities through. We also have to think about long and hard about environmental performance of our built environment and EPCs particularly. And we will see that continually be tightened by the government and hopefully a support network to enable property owners to continually improve their standard of insulation, etc. Turning to jobs and economic growth, that's probably the most challenging thing that is facing the UK right now, post-COVID. I believe there is an opportunity for a rural renaissance. Perhaps it's an opportunity once and for all to redefine the economy in the rural area. And perhaps, bury once and for all the sort of illusion that we all weave baskets in the countryside. Actually, people want to work in beautiful spaces. I think the days of big offices are potentially going to look very, very different. And I think people may want to work more locally and more creatively, perhaps. This building here is one that I was involved in my previous role up in Cheshire. And the tenant came to the estate originally wanting to be in a much sort of more modern location, but we persuaded him he wanted to be in the rural area, and it was a fantastic creative space. Talking about innovation and infrastructure with the land management hat on, it's easy to get sort of focused on aspects such as agri-tech and precision cropping, which definitely has its part to play in delivering sustainable food, and also reducing our reliance on artificial fertilizers. But we also need to think about our infrastructure and how we make that resilient. I mentioned earlier about the importance of digital connectivity. 5G is coming at us down the road, but we can't rely solely on that form of technology. We need to think about other means. Point-to-point wireless and hardwired internet are so important. And again, that's one of those topics that crosses over a number of these goals. Talking about inequalities, there are many social injustices in the UK, and rural deprivation is right up there. You'll see from the map on the screen that some of our most beautiful areas of the country are also the highest on the deprivation index. They lack access to basic services, they lack access to social care, healthcare, and they lack access to transport, and in some cases easy to reach education. And that's something that the land management sector, it's a difficult nut to crack, but nonetheless, in every decision, we need to be thinking about how we can improve opportunities for all. Sustainable cities and communities, that's been a key area of focus for the Duchy. Back in 1988, His Royal Highness did a programme called A Vision of Britain, where he talked about the good and the bad of architecture and design. But he also talked about the sense of place and the importance of community in the built environment. And continuing our sort of seeing as believing theme, within the Duchy, we've delivered most of the Poundbury development, and we're now working on Mansledden, where sustainability has really been at the heart of those schemes, and the communities have been at the heart of those schemes. We've created jobs and employment. We've ensured that people can walk and permeate through the developments. There isn't a reliance on cars, and good design has been at the heart of everything we've done. But that applies also to smaller developments of 2 or 3 houses. Good design has to be at the heart, and we need to consider things like affordable housing and making sure it's sufficient and suitable in the right places as well. Responsible consumption, again, we need to be more responsible in how we do things. The land management sector can do more. I'm still horrified by the amount of plastic that is used in food packaging. I think there's been a rather worrying rush back to plastic during COVID. It seemed to be the default position for everybody to make things safe. But we need to think about local food networks. you know, shop local, buy local, eat local. You know, this picture here is of the Newton Farm shop, where, you know, as you can see, there's an opportunity to minimise waste because you can pick your own veg, and you know, I think things like that we need to just build that into our DNA in terms of how we make decisions. In terms of the climate, as we've heard a number of times throughout the webinar series, the answer lies in the soil. We've got some massive opportunities in the land management sector to solve problems. If you do look at the order of magnitude, whilst emissions from agriculture are significant, it also holds the key. And how we manage land is absolutely crucial. And perhaps above any other industry, the land management sector is uniquely placed because it can sort its own house out, and it can also help sort other people's houses out in terms of offsetting carbon from other industries. We had an interesting presentation the other day from a national firm of agents, and they talked about an 8% reduction in emissions that's taken place since the onset of COVID. But in order to deliver our objectives, we need to achieve that every year. And what we can't do is crash the economy for 3 months every year. So we really have to think laterally about how we're going to deliver those zero carbon objectives. It's not always an obvious link between the land and the sea, but if you look at soil runoff, I mean, last autumn there were some aerial shots. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to share them on this presentation, but there were some aerial shots showing soil runoff in the Severn estuary during the floods, and you know, the whole estuary from satellite was brown. That's not a good place to be. The picture in the screen here isn't some idyllic Greek island. It is actually our most western tip of the duchy. It's the Isles of Scilly. And for a long time, we've been negotiating with South West Water, and they're going to adopt the sewerage and water provision to the islands, which will be a massive benefit not only to the islanders, but also to the marine habitat as well. Talking about life on land, we have to protect our biodiversity. And we all, as land managers, have that joint responsibility, not just to our neighbours and to our fellow sort of citizens on this island, but we have to remember that a great number of different species of wildlife migrate here for limited periods of time throughout the year. So we almost have a responsibility to look after those species on behalf of our neighbours as well. Important feature is that, you know, it's not just about standing still. The damage has been done to habitats, the damage has been done to wildlife, and we have that responsibility and obligation, you know, to help repair that damage and build back better. Peace and justice, again, it's an interesting one to think about. How does that relate back to land management? And I think the take I'm going to have is that, you know, I'm going to talk about accountable institutions, and as the Duchy, we are accountable. We do integrated reporting, and here's last year's report. And as I said earlier, we report on our KPIs, we report on our strategic objectives, but crucially, we also have reference to, you know, what our impacts are as an organisation. And I think that's a really good discipline, no matter what scale of business you're operating in the sector. In my last role, I began to report internally in a very similar way, because I think it's good to just take that slightly wider look and just judge your impact on others. And finally, goal 17, the partnerships for the goals. And really, for me, that's why we're here. You know, everybody that's participated in this series, the conversations that are taking place on the Slack channel, you know, those are the partnerships that are going to make this happen. And, you know, the collective and collaborative rural brain, I believe, can make a real difference. That's it from me. Thank you. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to turn my video on. There we go. So what I'll do, actually, Hilary, it's probably easier if I just leave my slide on, just because we're going to talk about some of the goals. Just bear with me. How's that?
Great.
So, Hilary, obviously, I've touched on all of the goals there, and we had lots of questions. I'm pleased to say that have come in, and points that have come in, which has been absolutely brilliant. Just looking at those, are there any that you'd like to just sort of expand on, taking on board what I've been talking about?
Well, I was just looking very quickly at the hundreds of questions and comments in the Q&A file, and there was a couple that struck me that linked very much to goal 2, which is sort of no hunger, which is linked to how we can square this circle of feeding an ever-growing, ever-burgeoning global population. And there were some questions in there about what is sometimes called sustainable intensification of agricultural land, or in other ways of the land sparing versus land sharing debate. Do you put all of your eggs in the really sort of fertile and highly productive agricultural land and go for maximum sort of food production in those areas, and leave other areas of land to deliver other ecosystem services in terms of water purification and biodiversity conservation? Or do you actually try and spread the ability of land to produce food across virtually all of the land that we have, maybe in a more extensive way, but perhaps a more using fewer chemicals and so on. So you have this land sparing versus land sharing dynamic, which is one of the really big trade-offs, as I was mentioning earlier, at the center of the Sustainable Goals agenda. And it's a really difficult and knotty question to answer. And I know there were people sort of asking my views on that on the chat. I'm not sure what I think about that. It's almost an impossible question to answer, and I think it has to be tailored to national and regional and indeed local circumstances. It has to be, and it has to be a choice that is widely debated, and there's real genuine stakeholder engagement in trying to come up with what's right for that particular level of governance that you want to engage in. So I was struck by that, and then I was also struck by the sort of issues around health. I mean, in a global context, we're hearing a lot these days about how the current sort of pandemic that we're in the middle of is at least in part attributed to illegal trade in wildlife. We don't know if it arose in some of these so-called wet markets or otherwise, but there is a generic problem here in terms of large amounts of animal movements across both locally in markets within a single country like China, or more generally in terms of pet trade or exotics or medicines or whatever it might be, trade in wild animals, which goes below all the sort of sanitary measures that that are meant to be in place. And then the really bigger question about the fact that the ecosystems are being degraded and fragmented, and that brings people much more into contact with the sort of with the vectors of disease, which would otherwise be tucked away safely in these virgin forests a long way from anybody, and then and how that affects the sort of the ecology of and the sort of epidemiology of disease, and releasing those vectors of disease into society, because people bump into wild animals on a much more regular basis. So there's a real big global issue about health. I was struck on the sort of the gender issues. I mean, it's fantastic. I love the way that in the UK we're really trying to make heroes out of many of our female land managers, whether it in farming or forestry. I see the Institute of Chartered Foresters and its "I Look Like a Forester" campaign, I think is fantastic, and I've supported that for many years. But at a global level, women are incredibly powerful, but yet below the line kind of arbiters in a lot of land management decisions. They're the people who very often access and control the sort of local production of produce, but through the sort of societal structures in many other parts of the world, they're disempowered from taking part in bigger decisions about that. I touched on the sort of water issue in what I said, and there's the debate about. I mean, I've heard the phrase of peak water being used. I mean, it's a bit of an old-fashioned thing to say now, but are we able to actually generate enough water for our global needs? Are we able to replenish the aquifers? We've had a 30% decline in the extent of water bodies in the last 40 years through work that we've done at the centre. And it's, there is a real issue that water is one of those resources that we have yet to really fully value. I could go on. I mean, the cities thing is really interesting too, because cities have an impact on both in terms of their own footprint, in terms of the immediate hinterland and the way in which they impact on the land, whether it's through the watersheds being in place to be able to protect the water supply of cities, and then a much more far-reaching effect through the medium of trade, which we've touched on. And then, climate action, we know that both climate mitigation measures can be very strongly linked to nature-based solutions, which is great, but also in terms of how we adapt to the inevitability of climate change and how we can sort of soften some of its worst impacts, and how the environment is a hugely critical part of that. And that's a lot of discussion going on about that in the UK with the Woodland Carbon Fund and so on. And there's some really interesting, exciting stuff about that. You touched on SDG 14 with the coasts, with oceans, life below water. But it's not just about the deep oceans. It's also about where land and sea meet, and about the impacts of how land management and the application of fertilizers, or how soil erosion or nitrification of watercourses, how that impacts on coastal coastal environments. And then obviously, the SDG 15, life on land, the one that I spend most of my time worrying about in the context of my day job. We are in a global crisis. We've got 1 million species potentially threatened with extinction, according to the IPBES Global Assessment Report. What untold damage are we doing to ourselves by the sort of erosion of genetic diversity, let alone the sort of functioning of pollination and the sort of intrinsic value of biodiversity, which we sometimes, quite a utilitarian way of looking at things, sometimes forget. So, there's so much that I could say. But what I really liked about your presentation, Matthew, was the way in which you kind of did what some of your correspondents were asking, was, what does it mean for me? What does it mean down in my part of the world? And I really like the way in which you translated, these great big sustainable goal dimensions down to very much a local, immediate level in terms of the duchy. And it shows it can be done, and people can think about how these big ideas and concepts can transpose to a very local level, which I think is a really good takeaway message for what you said.
Well, thank you, Hilary. I think, as I say, if I can do it, anyone can. It is, it's just spending the time breaking it down into each of those goals, and just really thinking long and hard. What can our business do? How can our impact, what will our impact be on that particular goal? And across the sector, if every business, if every management decision in land management, had reference to those goals, I think we'd go places pretty quickly.
Indeed.
Brilliant. Well, Hilary, thank you very much indeed for joining us today. And I'd just like to also thank all of our participants today as well. We've had I think we've had 197 actual points made, but what's happened is, as I hoped, people have actually voted up, so the actual number of responses is many-fold. So Tim and I will analyse that, and with Hilary's help, we'll answer any particular questions that need answering. But actually, just to get a sense of what you in the sector think you can do to help, we will get that up onto our website, and we will talk about it at our next session. So just before we close, I'd just like to thank a few people that have worked very hard behind the scenes to deliver our sessions. We've got Adele Jones has helped coordinate Tim and I, and pull lots of strands together. Kimberly has worked on the website, done YouTube and newsletters. Rupert has put together our case studies and worked on the partnerships. Mark's been managing Slack. Helen has been doing social media, and Philippa has been doing some blog writing. And Sam Jones from Rural Solutions has very kindly helped us out with our graphics and our website. I hope everyone found today's session really useful. We will have our recordings on our website. Tim's just going to, just touch on next steps. We've got a seminar booked. Tim and I are just going to spend a couple of weeks just reflecting and pulling together a sort of summary session, which is in 3 weeks' time on the 9th of July. Tim, do you want to say any more on that?
Yeah, I just think we've got this incredible bank of information, which we've now we haven't had time to reflect on over the last few weeks. So now it's time just to sit back, reflect, work with the rest of the presenters who've been on so far and the other organisations that have been part of the series. And yeah, just digest everything that we've got, work out what the questions are, the unanswered questions, and collectively work out what we want the next steps to be for Land Management 2.0. So yeah, 9th of July, we're going to reconvene for the 12th episode with all the presenters and talk about what the next steps are going to look like for us as a sector. So yeah.
Brilliant. Well, thank you. And we look forward to seeing as many of you as possible next time. And again, just thanks again to Hilary for joining us today. Fascinating stuff. And it's a goodbye from Tim and I. And stay safe, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.